Launching a podcast can seem overwhelming, but with advice from this week's guest, Britany Felix, it can be easier. With no prior podcasting experience, she launched her first show, which has led to more than 400 episodes across multiple podcasts. Tune in to get Britany's expert advice on identifying your ideal listener, developing compelling episode ideas, choosing the right equipment, and launching your podcast success. Welcome to the Podcasting Secrets Show, where successful creators share their best stories, secrets, and strategies. I'm your host, Nathan Gwilliam. Hello, incurable creators. Today, I am joined by Britany Felix. Britany is a podcast consultant and editor for Podcasts for Coaches. She personally has created more than 400 episodes for her 4 podcasts. She even successfully sold her first podcast, and she has a whole bunch of clients. She's produced more than 3,000 episodes for her clients. So Britany knows what she's talking about. And she's been invited to speak at basically every major podcasting conference. Thank you so much for joining us, Britany.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is really exciting. We've talked once before, and I'm excited to do it again.
Britany, can you start off by sharing with us your podcasting journey?
Yeah, I think it's fairly similar to a lot of podcasters. Maybe not so much now with the boom, but I started my podcasting journey back in 2015. And I actually was one of those people who I thought you had to have an iPhone to listen to a podcast. I didn't really know much about them or what they were, but a content creator that I followed in like the influencer marketing space said she was starting a podcast, and knew I had to figure out how to listen. And I checked it out, and the audio quality was absolutely terrible. Love her to pieces, but the show was not the most pleasant to listen to. And I mean, it may be a bit of an ego trip here, but I thought I could probably do better than this. Why don't I give this a shot? And so within 2 months of learning what a podcast was, I had my own show where I interviewed people who were living my dream lifestyle of traveling the world full time. That's travel is one of my main passions in life, and I wanted to find out how they were making that lifestyle work. And I had that show for, I believe, about 2 years. I did end up selling it, and as part of that journey, I thought I was going to get all these sponsors and be paid to be a podcaster, and it was going to be amazing. And that's just not how things typically go for a lot of podcasters. But I did learn a new skill in editing, and that kind of organically snowballed into the business that I still have today.
So in that show, before we talk about the business you have today, in that show that you sold about traveling and being able to live a remote lifestyle, where was the best place that you ever traveled that you loved the most?
So I was actually interviewing people who, at the time, I hadn't done much traveling. I was still working a corporate job. I was absolutely miserable. I would daydream about getting into a car crash on my way to work, just so I wouldn't have to go into the office that day. Like, it was soul crushing. And so I was kind of living vicariously through my guests. But we did eventually end up selling our home and traveling in an RV full time for, I think, like 4 months before finally settling down in Colorado, where we're at now, because we discovered that my husband does not like to travel full time, so we had to find a compromise. But since then, I've been all over Europe, places in Asia, and have just had a great time doing some solo travel. So my favorites have been Paris and basically all over Scotland, and Chiang Mai, Thailand.
Wow. Okay. So I have a daughter that's living in France right now. She's a
Oh, fun.
missionary. And my 2 favorite places outside the United States are Brazil and Thailand. I love Thailand. And in fact, we're going back. My youngest daughter is a senior this year, and we're taking her there for a senior trip.
Oh, that's so fun. I'm very jealous. I spent a month in Bali, and everybody thinks that that's going to be this amazing thing. Like, you spent a month in Bali on these beaches, and surprisingly, Bali was actually a bit of a letdown for several reasons. And then I went to Chiang Mai afterwards, and I was like, this is what I wanted from this trip. This is amazing here. And I thought, I was worried as like a female solo traveler being there by myself, and you hear all these horror stories. It was clean. It was fun. It was safe. I just had the most amazing time there, and I would go back in a heartbeat.
You do something that I haven't heard of a lot of people doing, and it's called podcast auditing. Can you tell us a little bit more about what podcast auditing is? And then we're going to come back and talk about what you do now. But I want to talk about this one element first.
Yeah, of course. So over the years, because I've been at this professionally since 2016, I spent a lot of times in Facebook groups answering questions for people. Podcasters who were on their journey and just they didn't know why things weren't working. They didn't know what they should try. They didn't know what was worth their time. And eventually it got to the point where I was like, why don't I just get paid to do this? And so what I do now is I go through for somebody who has an existing podcast. It's really best if you're about 6 months at least into the show. A year is maybe a little better. But we take a look at the show, and I do like a full review of the actual audio, the format of the show, the interviewing skills, your show descriptions, show titles, social media promotion, presence on your website, show notes, all the things, your artwork. And we really find what we can tweak to improve, maybe help things perform a little bit better, make it a better experience for your listener. And then we also, because I think it's important to remember that you're not always doing everything wrong. So we want to find your strengths that you can lean more into. And so that's really what we do with the podcast audit.
Kind of scared to have you do an audit for me.
And most people are, but that's where if you kind of remember that compliment sandwich that people say, like a positive, a negative, a positive, it's not just a bunch of me telling you everything you're doing wrong and you're a terrible podcaster. Like I said, we find the strengths as well. And a lot of people think that maybe they're doing everything wrong and they're not, but they might be doing some obvious things that they just haven't thought of because they don't know any better.
So what are some of the most important things that you tell people in the audit, the most common things that we could learn from?
So one, actually, I'm going to give you two. The two biggest things that just about every single person comes to me with that I have to break them of. They take way too long to get into the meat of an episode, especially if they're with a guest, or especially if they have a co-host. If there's somebody to bounce back and forth with, they have like a 10-minute conversation before they ever get to what the title of the episode is. That title is a
They talk
promise.
about their favorite travel destinations.
Exactly. But no, we talked about my podcasting journey first. We're good. No, that title is a promise to your listener. That's what they've clicked play on that episode for. And so if they have to listen to several minutes before you get to that, it's just not a good experience for them. So we want to get to that as quickly as possible. And then the other thing is promoting their show in the wrong way. So a lot of people only use the word subscribe. That's a holdover from when Apple Podcasts was like the big one and how their platform used to be. But a lot of people who aren't familiar with podcasts, and there are still a lot who aren't familiar, and at this point they're maybe a little too embarrassed to ask what a podcast is. They hear the word subscribe and they think it's paid. They think it's a paid subscription. And so I just have people tweak the language of saying subscribe or follow for free, because a lot of the platforms now actually don't even have a subscribe button anymore. That's not the language they use. They use follow. So if you tell someone to subscribe and they go into their app and they don't see subscribe anywhere, they don't know what they're supposed to do. So we just make that one little tweak when they're promoting the show. And we don't want to focus on Apple Podcasts only. So many people still, when they're sharing their show, they just give their Apple Podcast link and that's it. So you want to use something like pod.link, or something where it's going to be like a catch-all. It's one link that works for everyone and they can pick whatever their app is. If they have an app installed on their phone, it will just open their app for them and bring up your show. So let's promote it in the right way. That's every single person who comes to me, we have to get that out of the way.
I love that, how you kind of came from the direction of the biggest mistakes. Maybe we could go a direction with the show where we take a contrarian point of view.
Sure.
And maybe you could tell us, what are the top 5 ways to thoroughly mess up your show?
Ooh, so that's going to be definitely what I said before, where you just take forever to get to the content, or you pick some clickbaity title that is going to get somebody to hit play, but then there's not actually any real payoff for them. They'll never listen to another episode ever again.
Yep.
The other thing is, and I know a lot of hobby podcasters aren't going to want to hear this, but it kind of is what it is. It matters. Your audio quality is important, especially if you're podcasting as more than just a hobby. If you're doing it for the fun of it and you don't care how many listeners you have, then your audio quality can be garbage, and that's okay. But if you actually want to have your subscribers, your followers grow, if you want to eventually attract sponsors, if you want to eventually sell your own items on your podcast, any of those things, you have to have a good quality show. And I'm not saying it has to be NPR level quality. It does not. Like the amount of work you have to put in to make your show be good enough is actually really minimal. A lot of podcasters just aren't doing that. So we need to have a decent microphone, a decent recording space, decent recording software. None of those things have to be crazy expensive or complicated by any means, but we have to put in at least some effort. And honestly, my contrarian point of view on this is it's just flat out disrespectful to your audience if you don't do that. If you don't keep your audience's experience in mind as you're doing your show, you are doing them such a disservice, and they deserve better. They just really do.
Oh, wow.
And then I would say that another really big mistake people make is they don't have a good website for their show. And again, this doesn't have to be anything crazy, but we want to have individual show notes for each episode of your show. And that's for most people just looks like a blog on a basic website. And each episode has its own blog post. And we want to do that for SEO purposes, where it does not have to be this long form thing with like 15 paragraphs and this whole huge amount of effort. But we want to at least hit those keywords, get some SEO going, and have your show come up in search results when people are searching for topics related to your show.
Okay, so just explain the why behind that. Why is SEO so important?
So the SEO is how your show is going to get found when you're not promoting it. Let's be honest. In today's social media marketing landscape, if you don't already have a ton of subscribers and a ton of followers, you're going to get just kind of lost in the weeds. You're going to get buried, and you might have 6 people, like your post promoting your episode, 20 people, maybe even 100 people. But that's really not going to move the needle on your subscribers and get you to a point where you're getting the number of downloads each month that advertisers actually want to see. Because for most advertisers, it's a lot more than you think it is, and it's a lot more than most podcasters are ever going to see. So we work on other things like SEO so that when somebody is searching for a particular person, a particular topic, they have a question they're trying to find an answer to, your podcast then shows up on the first page of those search results. And so then they'll come to your website, and then they'll see that there is an episode that should be able to be listened to right on that webpage. Don't make them go off of it. Let them hit play right there. But then we want to have some subscribe links. So if they want to continue listening, then they can carry on that journey and subscribe to the show and become an active listener of the show. So the SEO is really kind of that first step in that journey of them becoming a regular listener.
What is the hardest thing you personally have had to go through in your podcasting journey, the biggest challenge, and how did you get through it?
That for me, definitely with my own podcasting journey was when we did sell our house and travel around that RV, I kept my podcast going, which was interesting because we were visiting national parks, which don't exactly have the best service and zero Wi-Fi. And so I had to change up the format of my show. Before that, I was doing 3 episodes a week. I was doing one interview with a guest that I would split into 2 episodes because we talked about 2 different topics, and then I would do a solo episode every week. So when we started traveling in the RV, I just couldn't keep up with the interviews. I did not have a good enough service. And again, if I would try to record in a public place, it would have been terrible for the audience. So I went to solo episodes only. I would batch record my episodes while my husband was like out exploring with our dogs, and I had the RV to myself. So I would record 3, 4, 5 episodes at a time. And then I would edit those all because, you don't, depending on what editing program you use, which at the time I used one called Audacity. I still do. It's free. You don't need internet service for it. So I would edit them all. And then when we got to a place that had service, I would use either my mobile hotspot or I would just park my butt in a Starbucks or something and use their Wi-Fi and sit there and wait all day just for these files to upload. And it was very tedious and stressful and frustrating at times because, a public Wi-Fi is not the greatest. You wait an hour for an episode to upload and then it fails right at the last minute. You have to start it again. So it was very frustrating, but my show was about travel and I was finally traveling. I needed to be able to keep it going. So
Yep.
that part of the journey was interesting.
Which was your favorite national park?
Zion. Oh
Yeah.
gosh, but they're all so good. We spent a lot of time in Utah. So, yeah, we spent a lot of time in Utah. Colorado, actually, we visited, and that's kind of why we decided to move out here, was because we just loved it so much. But Zion was pretty cool. It's kind of hard to beat.
Yeah, great hiking trails. We're actually taking our daughter. We have a trip to go to Zion's this summer and spend some time. And there's a theater called Tuacahn that I think is the most beautiful theater setting in America. And it's in the beautiful red rocks behind it. And it's just this, they hire actors and actresses from Broadway and bring them in, and they do 4 shows each season. And it's amazing quality. And then you hike Zion's and uh, yeah, very beautiful place to spend and visit in the summer.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
The reason I'm asking too is I live right by Yellowstone. We live up in Idaho, up that direction, and
Yeah, I
we
went
went.
to college in Montana for a little while, in Bozeman. So I was only about an hour and a half from the west entrance of Yellowstone. It's gorgeous as well.
Yeah, not too far. I'm like an hour and 15 from West Yellowstone. Tell me a little bit more about the services that you offer.
So what I mainly do, I do have those audits, but honestly, most people do a course that I have to like self audit their own show. So I mostly do launches. So I help coaches and consultants, online coaches and consultants, launch the podcast for their own business. It's like a marketing, networking, lead generation tool. And then I have editing that I do for a select number of clients. So every week I'm the one editing their show and publishing it for them, in some cases writing their show notes, posting it on their website, kind of all the things that they need from the post-production side of things, except for the marketing. So that's really the main focus of what I do there with podcasting for coaches.
What are the most important secrets that people need to know to effectively, successfully launch a podcast?
So a lot of people get really excited when they think about launching a podcast about like their artwork and the title and choosing like their fonts and their colors and this branding and setting up social media accounts. And I get that all of that stuff is so fun. But none of that stuff means anything if your show's not good.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people miss that they need to really spend some time in the beginning setting up a fantastic foundation for their show. And when I say foundation, there are 3 key elements of a good podcast that every podcaster needs to keep in mind. And that is you as the host, what you can sustain in terms of schedule, how often you're going to release episodes, solo versus interview, because those take different amounts of work, whatever's going to work best for you. And then you have your audience. So, whatever is going to work best for them, what they're going to like, what they're going to actually want to get from you, what they have time for. There's like a 6-hour history podcast out there. A busy mom's not going to be able to listen to that probably. So, your episode shouldn't be 6 hours long. So, we need to take that into consideration. And then we also have the objective of your show. What do you want the show to accomplish? Why are you doing this show? And I think most people don't give thought to any of those things really when they launch. And so we really need to sit down and focus on each of those 3 key pieces and dive into those before we start making any other decision for the show. Because once you have those 3 figured out, honestly, it makes every single step of the process after that, coming up with your title, coming up with the format of your show, so much easier because you can just ask yourself, is this going to serve me, my audience, and my objective? And if the answer is not a yes, then you have your answer to whether or not, you make one decision over another.
Thank you very much. What is the most important thing that a client has done to help make sure they've had a successful launch? Some client that you've worked with that's just had an extraordinary launch. What was their secret sauce?
They took it seriously. So a lot of my clients, my clients are a little different than most podcasters because they are doing it as part of a business. So they do tend to take it seriously, but some take it more seriously than others. And so some, it is a key component of their business. It's going to be their main marketing tool. So they are actively working on it all the time. They're actually taking my advice instead of just being like, oh, well, this seems fun. Let's do this instead, even though it kind of goes against what I tell them to do. Or, I'll tell them like, maybe this week we shouldn't use this artwork for this reason, this reason, this reason. And they're like, yeah, but I like it. So let's just use it anyway. So the keys to success are actually listening to the people who know what they're talking about, and then implementing on that and not just sitting around, like actually taking action. It's so easy to get overwhelmed by the process of launching a podcast that I think it's really important to just like think of it as one task at a time. Don't think of this whole process of launching a show one task at a time, complete that, go to the next, complete that, go to the next, and just be taking constant action. Those people who do that, they stick with their show. They still have, I mean, I have clients I've been working with who I helped them launch their show 4 or 5 years ago, and we're still going. And I help them put out an episode every single week because they take it seriously. They listen to me, so they're seeing success with their show, and they take that consistent action.
I would add one thing to that. I agree with you that consistent action, but it's also consistent action on the most important thing. Sometimes we
Yes.
take consistent action and we're spinning our wheels on things that don't matter. And
Yep.
it's important that we're there's always too much to do. There's always more on our
Yes.
plate than we'll ever have time to do. And we can be thick in the thin of things, if that makes
Right.
sense. Thick and thin things, however that quote goes. And we need to make sure that we know what the next we have the priority list, right? And we focus on one thing, like you said, but it's the most important thing. And then when
Right.
we're done with that, we work on the next most important thing.
Yep, absolutely. And you and I had talked before doing this interview about like what a key to my success is, and I might be jumping ahead of you, so apologies for that.
No, go
But
for
it
it.
actually fits in here because that's my answer for that is that I focus on the things that I do well, and then I just ignore everything else.
Yeah.
Because I tried doing those things. I tried, creating audiograms for my show and having these social media accounts where I'm posting on every single day and creating these like, videos. These at the time it was like reels on Instagram, doing all the things that they say you're supposed to do. And it was awful and it got me nowhere because that wasn't really what worked for my show or me. So that was taking action on the wrong things, the things that I was not good at, I didn't enjoy. They were just a waste of my time. I did not have a return on investment of my time. And so, yeah, I completely agree with you focusing on the right things at the right time.
Because sometimes there's those things that we just don't like to do. Like, I don't
Yes.
love to create presentations, right? And but it may be the most important thing. And sometimes we just put off the things we don't like and we focus on the things that we like, and then the important things don't get done. So it's important to not work on what we want to do sometimes, but
Right.
what we really
Stay
need
in
to
your zone of genius. And if
do.
you can't outsource, then just put in the minimum viable effort.
As you've done 400 episodes on your show, have you ever had some interesting guests? Maybe you've had some
Sure have.
amazing guests, and maybe you've had some guests that um, challenged you a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about those two guests? What makes an amazing guest an amazing guest? And what are some of the things you've seen that makes a guest a little bit more challenging?
Yeah. So for me, an amazing guest for a podcast is one who thinks about the experience and they devote their attention to that 30 minutes that we're going to be on the phone call. So they're in a quiet space, they have a decent microphone, and by decent, it doesn't even have to be like a fancy external mic. It can be earbud microphones as long as they're like careful about how they use it. And they're focused, they're giving me their attention. I had one guest one time who it's still to this day. I just can't believe this experience. But literally while they were on the phone with me, they were like running and doing like a foot bath for themselves in the kitchen where their wife was cooking. And I was like, I finally had to stop him, and I was like, is there something going on over there? Like, do we need to reschedule? And he was mortified. He didn't think I could hear any of that. I was like, "Yeah, I can hear you running the water. I can hear you putting the stuff in the tub. I can hear your wife, like, moving all these dishes around." And he just didn't think about it. And so you don't be that person. Be the person who is there and focused and in a quiet space. But conversely, like, I have had guests who I just never ever thought I would get to speak to or interview. On my travel podcast, I interviewed somebody, a woman who was the first woman to summit Everett from both the north and south faces.
Wow.
And hearing her, and if you know the movie Everest, There was kind of a harrowing experience where some people were caught on the mountain, and she was there. She wasn't in that, but she was there at like a lower base, and she could hear all the stuff happening on the radio. And so just getting to hear her experience firsthand was just so incredible. And then I had another gentleman I interviewed who was traveling the world making a documentary about adventurers who were either blind or going blind, and he was blind himself. So it's these people who are hiking these mountain passes and sailing across oceans while they're blind. And hearing him just share all of his experiences and conversations with these people who are doing these truly epic things in life, with a condition that, a lot of people would find debilitating, was very inspiring. And so those guests, the ones that really stand out to me, um, they have a story to share, and they're there to share it. They don't regurgitate the same information every single time. They're real, they're raw, they're honest. And so those are always the fun guests.
Okay, so you said that amazing guests have amazing stories, and you've already shared a lot of your amazing story. Maybe we can dive just a little bit deeper and get you to share a little bit more of that story. You've told us that you've had 4 different podcasts. I'm assuming you don't operate 4 podcasts right now. Is that right?
No, the most I ever had at one time was 2.
Okay, so that means you've stopped doing at least 2 podcasts. Can you tell us the story behind stopping your podcasts?
Yeah, so with the first one, that was the travel one that I had for about 2 years, and I stopped it because that wasn't my focus anymore. Like, travel is always gonna be my main passion in life. That will be a focus. But I started that podcast because, again, I thought I was going to get, like, sponsors and these, like, travel deals to go travel to places and stuff, and then I leaned more into podcasting. And so eventually I just kind of had to know that it was time to let that go. Even though it was so much fun. I loved having the conversations I was having, but it just wasn't serving the purpose that I thought it was going to serve, and I only have so much time in a day. And at the time, actually, I had started a second podcast, which was a local one about the city I lived in. We had just moved to Colorado Springs after the RV trip, and I thought a cool way to learn about my new city and maybe make some connections was to start a local show where I talked about current events around town, reviewed restaurants, experiences, those sorts of things. But between doing those 2 shows and my business really taking off, I just didn't have time. So some things had to go off my plate. So I did just outright stop my local Colorado Springs show. And that's a show that I actually had a sponsor for even before it launched. So it was bringing in some revenue, but just not enough. And I needed more time. With the travel show, I left it up. I left it out there. But I didn't handle it in the best way. I just kind of stopped putting out episodes and let it pod fade, as we say, which is where it just we just fade away as a podcaster, and it went to the podcast graveyard. But it was still out there for people to listen to. And I had spent 2 years putting out episodes 3 times a week for the most part, and doing those show notes that I talked about and having that SEO. And it got to the point where it was in the top podcast for a lot of key search terms in the travel space, including the term digital nomad. It was the number 4 podcast in all of, at the time, iTunes for the term digital nomads. There was a listener of mine who was wanting to start a business where he helped digital nomads gain residency in certain countries. He was offering a service to help facilitate that process. And he found my podcast by searching for that. And he noticed that I had those key rankings. And so he reached out to me and asked me if I would be open to the idea of him basically taking over that show, because he wanted to keep those rankings in Apple. He wanted to keep all the SEO I had built. He wanted to take over the website. And we had a couple of discussions over the course of a few months. And yeah, I did end up selling him my show. And we did a transition episode where I explained what was happening. And he took over as the host. He took over the website, the hosting, all the assets for it. I owned all the previous episodes, and he did not have rights to use those in any new way other than they'd already been used. But everything from that point on became his, and he took it over and ran with the show for a little while and used it to promote his own business.
Love it. Great story. Thank you for sharing. If our audience has enjoyed this episode like I have, and they want to learn more about you and your products and services, what are the best ways for them to do that?
So I do have a website that makes it very easy. It's just podcastingforcoaches.com. That has all the things, my services, my contact information, social media links, courses, everything you need is right there. So podcastingforcoaches.com.
Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for all the value that you shared with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Here are my key takeaways from this episode. Number 1, get to the main content and theme of your podcast episode quickly. Don't spend too long on introductory small talk. Number 2, promote your podcast properly, using words like follow rather than just saying subscribe, and provide links that work across platforms. Number 3, do a podcast audit regularly to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of your format, audio quality, interview skills, etc. Number 4, have good audio quality and production value to show respect for your listeners. Number 5, create a website and write high-quality show notes for each episode to improve SEO. Number 6, build a strong foundation first, focused on the host, audience, and objectives before launching. Number 7, take consistent action on the right high-payoff activities based on feedback from experts. And finally, number 8, stay focused on your genius zone rather than getting distracted trying to master too many new media formats. If you're looking for a great all-in-one podcasting platform that can help you create, grow, and monetize your business around a podcast with more than 35 integrated modules, you can get a free trial at podup.com. Thank you for joining us for this episode. I wish you success as you launch your podcast and focus on your genius zone.